"What about my stab in the eye?" called Pedestrian, writhing around on the laundrette floor, obviously unable to get up or do anything other than wriggle in an epileptic yet erotic manner. "What are you going to do about it?" chortled Goat. He thought to himself, "You look just like Snail." Unfortunately, Goat had forgotten to keep his mouth shut while thinking again.
"Don't ever speak about Snail like that!" screamed Pedestrian. "I loved him!"
Pedestrian was furious. He noticed a puddle of laundrette juice spilt on the floor beside him, and saw his chance to glide speedily towards Goat, knocking him into the air like a bowling pin. Pedestrian had been bowling champion for 5 consecutive years during the 90s, primarily due to being the only competitor with opposable thumbs, but he unfortunately suffered a humiliating and public downfall, emotionally portrayed in the biblical "The Day I Injected a Bowling Ball," published by nobody. Goat slipped on the laundrette juice and soared through the air, in particularly slow motion, but eventually flew into one of the surrounding washing machines. Pedestrian blew the door shut, and then blew the machine on. Pedestrian was of course once a world-renowned blower, rumoured even to have blown members of the royal family, a rumour supported by Queen Elizabeth II's My Pedestrian Blowjob, published in blood. 1 hour and 40 minutes later, the washing machine finished its sexy cycle, giving Goat time to pierce the door with his tiny horns. Yes, that's right, tiny horns. The washing machine had shrunk him to about the same size as a car. No, a model car. Model car? Model car. Model car. During this time, Pedestrian had bled to death, producing a feast of substances from his many orifices. Fortunately, however, he was still slightly warm, so Goat made the most of this and death-raped him until his arse split up through his back, causing Goat to finish himself off in Pedestrian's skull. He hadn't even realised how far up he'd gone, so you can imagine how he chuckled when he finished squirting and noticed his juices oozing out of Pedestrian's nose. "I'm rather amused," he said, rather amused. Goat skipped back to Swan, telling him the exciting news. After leaving out no detail, Swan was disgusted and couldn't stop being sick for the next 19 hours, but nevertheless acknowledged the Swannish rules, and Goat was now indeed Swan's tallest associate. Or was he? Indeed, he was not. Indeed. Indeed? Indeed. For Goat, of course, had been shrunk in one of Pedestrian's washing machines. Despite attempting to balance on his many rapies' legs, he wasn't fooling anyone. That meant that even a little squirrel named Squirrel was taller than him, and he was a past associate of Swan. They had, of course, been lovers during Swan's adventurous episode of 1992, hilariously and cruelly depicted in the Late Owl's Woodland Knob Jockeys, published by Bender Bash Books. Swan looked everywhere for Squirrel's phone number, but not only did he love him, but was also rather keen for that crazy Goat not to organise his wedding. But Squirrel did not have a phone, for he was a squirrel. Swan himself did not have a phone for very much the same reason, so who knows what he would have done even if he had found a number for Squirrel. By complete chance, and for the purpose of this story, Squirrel was performing at Horse's Poetry Gathering that evening, and word quickly spread of this, for Squirrel was of course the most famous poet of all, outselling both the Bible and Fuck Then Kill Cub Club, with a collection of just two-line short poems entitled Piss Stains. £1,413.12 at all disreputable bookstores. Everyone has a favourite poem in this collection. Mine's For Fuck's Sake, the story of Squirrel 4 and Swan's Sake. What's yours? Swan went to see Squirrel at the poetry gathering and realised that all of Squirrel's latest poems were still about him. They were both still in love, and having Squirrel as best man was in fact not enough for Swan. He wanted to marry him. Squirrel was always a great believer in courtship, so Swan knew he would have to woo him all over again. But by the time he had successfully managed to seduce Squirrel, it was time for Swan's wedding to Swanee, who didn't realise her relationship was on the rocks until she entered the church in her whorishly see-through wedding dress and found Swan and Squirrel performing mock rape of each other on the altar. She wept, consoling herself by masturbating her father. This is traditionally how swans grieve, or at least that's what her father told her. "If we don't get married in the next 5 minutes," wailed Swanee, "we'll be punished in the traditional Swanish manner. The no marrying time, chop leg, stretch neck penalty." "Who invented these fucking traditions?" snarled Swan. "Then so be it." "I do wish you wouldn't swear so much, dear,"
sighed Swanee, as her own father ripped off her legs and used them to stretch her neck to 3 times its previous length. Squirrel volunteered to do the same to Swan, and was surprised by how much he enjoyed the process. "But wait!" gasped Swan. "If we're out of time, then Squirrel and I can't marry either."
Don't be a twat, Swan,
said Swanee's father, twat.
Squirrel's a squirrel, and you're a swan. Cross-species weddings involving swans and squirrels can take place at any time within the next 5,000 minutes.
"Everyone knows that," pointed out Signpost, who, despite being the tallest, is of course an inanimate object, and therefore obviously would not be able to be best man. That would be ridiculous. Laughing away, Signpost lost his balance and fell over, crushing Swanee with his shiny hexagonal head. All seemed well, except for Swanee's death, though nobody actually cared, least of all Twat. But Swan and Squirrel became so relaxed with the large amount of time they had that they completely forgot about getting married, and couldn't of course rely on their best man Goat with his unsatisfactory organisational skills. Time had run out, and as everyone knows, if a cross-species wedding between a swan and a squirrel does not take place within the dedicated time, it can never take place. The punishment for squirrels is that they can marry only inanimate objects, while swans can marry only goats. "That's convenient," thought Goat.
Fuck off, Goat,
snapped Swan, for Goat had yet again thought out loud. "Oh, go on, Swan. I promise to try not to rape you."
Go on then.
So with a distraught squirrel and their best man, Tiny Goat and stretch-necked no-leg Swan married, Twat died of laughing at his daughter's death, and weeks later Squirrel and Signpost found love, or rather Squirrel and Signpost realised they were the only ones eligible to marry each other in the entire nation. Swan and Goat went on honeymoon in France, where they discovered that Snell had never died after all, but had all his body stolen by a chef, left with only his eyeballs and shell, which a passing frog named Frog had kindly stuck together with a tadpole hanging out of his abhorrent anus. Snell had always been furious at being deserted by his chums and had vowed to kill them, but of course was not able to travel in his condition. The fury had built up so much that his shell had expanded and was now large enough to engulf both Tiny Goat and Swan, even with his ridiculous neck. He did engulf them, and they both suffocated in a horrendous but stylish technique, using their Paralympic synchronized swimming experience to its fullest. Weeks later, Squirrel and Signpost round-the-world honeymoon trip came to France, where Signpost was literally teased to death by the higher-speed autoroute signposts. Squirrel, alone and horny, bumped into a giant-shelled snail named Snail, and they began a night of passion on stage at a French poetry gathering, a moment that apparently inspired Penguin's 19th century rap sonnet, Ode to Sex on Stage. The passion became so intense that Squirrel, with Snail's eyes right up his furry rectum, became trapped in the shell. "Squirrel?" came a tiny voice from the darkness of the monstrous shell. It was Goat. He had never died.
Snail's eyes?
And Swan was there too. All 4 creatures were so excited that they kissed and made up. The presence of 4 animals in this shell was now stretching its limits, and one by one they all suffocated. Snail's eyes first of all, then Squirrel, and then so on. "I'm pleased." Goat was pleased. He had been the last to die, which meant getting to have his first death-rape orgy. As Goat himself drew his last breath, he was sad. "I'm sad," he sighed, for he realised that there was no one left to death-rape him. He tried to start raping himself, hoping that when he died his rotten corpse may still shudder every now and again, providing sufficient activity up his rear to constitute death-rape. Had he known what would happen 6 years later to his decomposed carcass, he would have died with a much larger smile on his tiny and grotesque face. A pedestrian, yes, pedestrian, was floating across the channel. He liked little else but floating since the loss of his limbs, and discovered a large shell floating amongst the mass of sewage. He looked inside and found the maggot-ravished Goat, death-raped him, and floated on. So, Pedestrian never died after all in his laundrette, but only pretended to die so Goat would eye-stab death-rape him. And do you know who Pedestrian is? Well, Pedestrian is I, and I never actually died, as I've already explained and proved due to my presence in the channel, Death-Raping Goat. I was saved and carried to the coast by Kitten, who travelled from the past using one of my washing machines, and I expressed my gratitude in the form of murder and rape, which meant that this happened to Kitten twice. Remember the poetry gathering? What larks? So death rape was clearly his destiny. If nothing else, my existence does mean I get to feature at the end.
The end, said Pedestrian, and it was. Just after the word spoken was spoken.